welcome to the Metapod, the Pokemon podcast that revolves around the evolving meta and is also aware of many, many, many other trading card games. I'm Jake, that's Sean. Sean, how have you been in the last couple days that we last recorded? But to the viewers, it's been a week.
I know. I've been well. I've been very busy at work, and you, Jake, have been very busy at moving, as our viewers on YouTube will see. Our listeners, though, so you can visualize. You know those gray tubs that you get at Target and other places? That is what Jake's setup is now.
That is the new background. Pretty much, I would say pretty much almost all the way packed. For anyone who doesn't know, this is a pre-recorded episode a couple days in advance of the episode because I, at the time that this releases, will be on the way across the country. So just trying to get some stuff in now so you guys do not miss a single week, but here to record. Sean, did you pick up any I know I saw you picked up some 151, made an extra video on our YouTube channel that you can plug to the viewers?
Yeah, I did. I picked up some 151. Included in that, I'm holding up a Charizard EX special illustration rare. And then I opened extra packs after. I only recorded a video with one of them, but I got two of the Zapdos. So
nice.
And in a future episode,
really good ETB.
Yeah, that the one ETB, the very first one, which is the one I recorded, was the best by far.
Yeah.
So, and you know, you can't go wrong. I got an Alakazam, but I didn't just get one, Jake.
You got two of the same ones.
I got two full art Alakazams, and the energy from 151 is just hot.
Yeah.
I will say, this is a triple swirl psychic. None of my others have a swirl in it, but this one has three swirls in it for people who care.
I was gonna say, I've seen some people open 151, and I've seen people like look at the swirls and stuff like that. Very, very cool. The Galaxy Holofoil. It definitely is done better in execution than when I first saw the images when it was first announced.
Yeah, they're gorgeous. I mean, 151 is an awesome set because of all the different illustration arts, as a lot of specialty sets are, but like it's dope. The burbs, especially the illustrations of the birds, are just so good. So,
and now you have one that you can riffle shuffle constantly, and you have one that you can keep pristine, easy.
Yeah.
But hopefully you all have gotten some 151. It did release this past week, Pokemon 151, the new holiday set. Again, it's not something you can get in booster boxes, just like the previous episode that we talked about, ETBs, booster bundles, different displays of products that you can get at your local card shops. And so make sure you go check that out if you have not already. Hopefully you can find some in Target, Walmart, game stores, things like that. But we're not just going to talk about Pokemon today, Sean. So this is a inquiry that we put out to all of you a couple weeks ago about, Sean and I are interested in more things outside of Pokemon. So how does Pokemon fare with? How does it relate to, compare, or what are other card games like? So that's going to be the discussion for this episode today. Sean and I have listed 6 other card games that we have information about to talk about alongside kind of Pokemon and stuff. So going to be an interesting episode today.
Yeah. They're all going to be, I would say, more of the popular card games. You're not going to hear us talk about old card games that are dead. I'm thinking about the old Naruto CCG or the my friend really liked the Highlander game back in the early 90s. We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about the crazy weird Japanese games like Weiss Schwartz or whatever. Like, this is going to be the stuff that you could walk into probably any game store and they will have almost all of these products.
Or at least have one point sold the product, if they're out.
Yeah, exactly. So,
which we'll get to later.
Yes, indeed. But Jake, let's get into, do we want to do it? I guess everyone here has a baseline of Pokemon that's listening, so we don't really need to talk about it, but quick little intro. Pokemon did release in Japan in, I believe, 1998. And then in the States in 1999, just to give you a context as to when it came out. it was during an era of card game explosions. And the reason for all of the explosions of card games in the 90s, alongside baseball cards, I think went crazy in the 90s. Just people liked opening cards. And I think that we're kind of in another era of that right now, actually. But
Hmm.
so Pokemon released in this era as a Japanese game that was brought over alongside two of the other OGs. So one of them being Yu-Gi-Oh, but I think we should start off with the original card game in Magic the Gathering. Jake, what is your relationship with Magic, if any?
So it's been a couple years, definitely before my Kentucky era, that I moved to. For all the Metapod lore listeners out there, um, I have played a little bit of Magic the Gathering, the arena. I have some of the starter decks that were released probably around like 2019 or so, or somewhere in that time. And I feel like I have just a very, very, very rough baseline of how Magic the Gathering works, with lands and things like that, and, resource management, things like that. And I also really enjoy watching, pro tours of Magic the Gathering. One of the channels that I do go to every so often is the Will Hall EXP. They do like a pro tour coverage 24/7 channel to support like efforts in helping places like Ukraine and stuff like that, charity stuff. So I tend to watch that. I really do enjoy that, but probably for the discussion that we're having, not very good.
Yeah, I mean, I think though that you have a very baseline level of how the game
Hmm.
works, and for everybody out there, Magic is very different from Pokemon in a
Yes.
number of ways. If you weren't aware, the goal of Magic is to reduce your opponent's life from 20 in a normal game to 0. And you do that by attacking them with monsters. Now, you might think off the top of your head, attacking them with monsters, that sounds like Pokemon, right? I have a Pokemon and I attack my opponent. But in reality, in Pokemon, you're attacking your opponent's Pokemon, and it's a one-on-one battle every time, right? Like, for the most part in Pokemon's history, it's always just one-on-one. In Magic, however, you can attack with any number of monsters, and your opponent can actually block with their own monsters.
Hmm.
So it's a back and forth game of fighting and trying to deal damage that your monsters do to reduce your opponent's life total. Uh, that's just the broad nutshell of the game. But Jake, I know you said you kind of briefly got into it. What was your perception of Magic when you first like were dabbling, and how might it have been different from when you actually got your hands on cards?
So I think one of the things is Magic Arena, at least from the perspective of somebody who wants to get introduced into the game and maybe just learn the very basics of the game. Magic Arena is a great client. I was able to pick it up. I was able to learn quickly. I thought the tutorial was really, really good in learning and understanding, not overwhelming you with stuff left, right, center, all this 25 years of this. How long has
Yeah.
Magic been around?
No, it's been around 30 years now.
30 years, 30 years
Yeah.
of card game knowledge, thrown into my 21-year-old brain, you know. It was just very, very good in that aspect, I felt like. And it is a lot, once you get out, probably outside of that broader sense, but the baseline that you can get off of like Magic the Gathering Arena is very good, to where if you eventually buy like the starter decks and you play the starter deck, and that's just a really good introduction to be able to like read the cards, right? That's one of the things that a lot of people that have joined different card games will tell you, is that when stuff releases, and when you get into a new card game, and there's so much out there, it you're just able to, once you start playing around, a couple games, whether that's a starter deck or whatever, you're able to read the cards, new cards that you see, and your understanding of them. The processing in your brain is much, much faster. So it is a bigger jump to get into, but it's also probably one of the more easier jumps to get into because it is so plentiful. Like,
Yeah.
I've talked about here in Kentucky where I don't have like any card shops that do Pokemon within like 45 miles. There's a couple card shops around me within like a 15-minute radius that just do Magic. So it's the most popular. It's probably got some of the most people that play as well. And I'm sure they're more than happy with new people.
Yeah, I think that's a big draw for a lot of people with going to
Mhm.
Magic because it is the most I will say I think it's the most played trading card game in the world.
Yes.
Um like a lot of people play Pokemon, a lot of people play Yu-Gi-Oh and all these other games, but in general, you can go into any card shop and if that card shop doesn't have Magic, I think that is an exception to the rule. Like
Hmm.
strongly. Um but I do think something I want to point out with Magic that's a little different from Pokemon. With Pokemon, if you rock up, I don't think anyone I think every single person who walks up with a Pokemon deck, the expectation is that you have a standard deck.
Hmm.
Magic is very different these days. I think, if you play on Arena, you might play with a standard deck. I think that if
Like
you
a
want to be a,
given deck to you.
yeah, or just cards within a 2 year time pool, right? That's so
Hmm.
Magic has a ton of different formats, and standard is like our standard. It's like roughly 2 years, 60 cards, yada yada. So you'll feel very familiar if you want to go into that, but and that's definitely what you need if you want to play that style of game. You should lean towards the online client because you'll find players a lot more easily. But in-person Magic, I actually am like I think it's really you have two formats to choose from if you want like the most available player base. And that is either
Hmm.
modern, which is it's kind of like our expanded format. It doesn't go all the way back to the beginning of Pokemon, but it goes back quite a while in Magic's history. And so you have a much larger pool of cards, but that also makes the format more expensive.
Hmm.
Um, or you can play Commander, which anybody who's heard of Magic in the last like 3 or 4 years, probably that's the format you're familiar with, which is it's a
Or
hundred
also,
cards.
the GLC. We've talked about
Yeah.
GLC a couple times. That's similar in an aspect.
Yes. So like with GLC, you can only have one of each card. With Commander, it's the exact same way. Couple of differences is that Commander, it's 100 cards. It's a little different. You
Good luck
have
shuffling.
right, right. This is fair. This is true. And then the biggest difference, though, is that Commander is kind of designed to be a four-player ish game, which you can't do in Pokemon. So I would say if you have an itch as a player, a Pokemon player, to like see what a 3-player, 4-player, 5-player kind of game feels like, um, Commander specifically is a tried and true format for that. Um, yeah, like so. I just wanted to give like a quick heads up of like I think format wise, that's maybe the biggest deviation from Pokemon is that
Hmm.
you know 99% of players in Pokemon play standard, and then maybe like 10% play some other format, whether that's GLC or expanded.
I also
Maybe
think
a little
there's
more.
this essence. There's this essence too of collecting. That's like, you think about Pokemon, and 151. Oh, it's the original 151 Pokemon. We'll talk about these later. Digimon. Oh, it's the Digimon that you see in the show. One Piece. Oh, it's the One Piece characters. Yu-Gi-Oh, it's stuff from the anime or the manga. I don't know if Magic really has that. I mean, I know it has its own lore and it has its own kind of thing, but Magic is one of those that were just derived by Magic, not necessarily
Yeah.
an other entity trying to make cards. It was like the cards made themselves and that kind of
Yeah.
story essence thing. I think I could be wrong about that. Feel
No,
free to let us know in the comments if that's not correct.
you're absolutely right, Jake. It's its own IP. As
Yeah.
somebody who didn't come into Magic, who came into Magic from the outside, I was like, I don't know who any of these characters are. I don't know if I care. I still don't really care about the story, to be honest. That's not everybody, but that's me. I don't care. So, you know, yeah, you're not going to have a nostalgia hit. The one difference, though, Magic does wild stuff these days. There's a Doctor Who set coming out in a few weeks.
Yes.
There was
They
a
just
Lord of the
recently did a
Rings.
Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
Yeah. They do
With the
secret
one
layers.
card.
Yeah, they do secret layers. They have Stranger Things. They've got D&D stuff. You know, look, they're the most wild in terms of the major TCGs about crossover IP. And I think
Because like they're their own IP, you know.
exactly. It's not like, oh, the Pokemon are fighting alongside the Avengers. Isn't that crazy? Yeah, that would be crazy. That would be
Pokemon would
stupid.
never allow that.
No. So, um, I think one of the big conceptions, and then we can move on to, I think, Yu-Gi-Oh!
Mhm.
One of the other big things about Magic is Wizards originally, when they had the Pokemon license, they were thinking of it as Pokemon is an entry trading card game for kids, and then Magic is what you graduate to as an adult. I think we all sort of understand now that that's not necessarily the case, that like Pokemon can be very complex and, you know, is designed for people of all ages. But Magic is not. Magic is
Mhm.
very complicated. I think kids can play it, but especially if you're getting into like commander format, it can really get confusing. And I would, if you're the kind of player that doesn't like crazy complicated board states, tons of things to remember on every other player's turn, including your own, Magic is not going to be a game for you. Like, I'm not saying it's overly complicated, but like every time you sit down, I feel like I learn something about cards I've never seen before or whatever, or like how combos work. And so it's interesting in that way, but also a little bit frustrating sometimes.
I will say that's a great transition into Yu-Gi-Oh! Because Yu-Gi-Oh! I feel like is
Yes.
actually the same way in terms of its complexity and, you know, being a card game that's been around for over 20 years now, released in Japan in 1999 and in North America in March 2002. It's been around for a while. Big time card game. You've probably heard and or played it, collected the cards. An IP that's very, very well known. I think like if they have, I think like card stores, if you go to a card store, here's how it ranks. It goes Magic the Gathering, they definitely have it. Pokemon is next, and then it goes into Yu-Gi-Oh! More often than not, they'll have both Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! It's very uncommon to not see one without the other in there, I feel like, in terms of like singles and being able to sell product. Yu-Gi-Oh! Sean, how much Yu-Gi-Oh! Have you played?
I played it as a kid, probably incorrectly in terms of how you summon monsters.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing I did since I bought the new sets that had like the old school cards in it, and I
Yeah.
did pull a Blue Eyes.
Nice. Blue Eyes White Dragon. Sean, you got the Charizards, you got the
I
Blue Eyes
know.
White Dragon. What do you not have? Do you have a Black Lotus?
I don't have a Black Lotus.
That's a
No.
Magic the
Yeah.
Gathering reference. It's like how much is that? Like over
$1
it's
million.
thousands upon thousands. Yeah, it's very expensive. Anyways, Yu-Gi-Oh! I have in the last couple weeks, not necessarily preparing for this episode, but just in my own interest, you know, my own casual look before I started packing everything up, I started playing Yu-Gi-Oh! What is it? Duel Links or Master Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. There's like two online clients for Yu-Gi-Oh! There's Duel Links and Master Duel. So that's already confusing in itself. I think probably Master Duel is what you want to go to if you want to get into it. And let me tell you, I think the tutorial and stuff for Yu-Gi-Oh! The client is amazing. It is so fun. It is cool. I like playing the game. Um, and again, it is very well explained. It goes in steps and stuff like that, playing. But oh my God, there are so many things. There's the normal summon that you can do. There's the special summon, right, where you take out your dudes. But there's a side deck that has special summons alongside of it. that are on the specifically the top of the board that have like the corner things. People that know what I'm talking about. And then there's spells and traps that activate at different times during your opponent's turn, whether they're attacking you or maybe they're putting down a card that you react to and that you have to do. And then there's monsters that you can summon that are actually just like spells and traps. They're I I'm up for learning, right? I love learning. I love learning new card games. I love learning how to do stuff, but I would never ever play Yu-Gi-Oh in real life because I know I would never play it right.
Yeah.
There is so much stuff that happens. And maybe it's just because I haven't gotten too long into it. Maybe I'm just at, the basic level and this is very normal for people who are getting in the game, but I'll play like online with a friend, right? We've sometimes played like private battles against each other, friend battles or whatever, and we just buy like one of the theme decks or whatever in the store and then just play each other with it. I very frequently playing those be like, oh yeah, I could do this, but no, I can't. Or like, yeah, if I do this, then this is gonna happen. But then something else happens because the online client, will do it for you, essentially do the kind of action that you're doing for you. And so it is so confusing. I need I don't know if maybe I just stepped into the wrong place at the wrong time, but Yu-Gi-Oh is one of those things that if you want to get into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, you better have a lot of time on your hands, and you better maybe also have known stuff previously.
Yeah, so like again, Yu-Gi-Oh is similar to Magic, wherein the goal is to reduce your opponent's life total to 0 from I think
Yes.
8,000 is the starting point. 10
Yes,
maybe
8,000.
Yeah, I mean the numbers are just they make sense in the world of their card game.
Mhm.
And yeah, like you play monsters. The difference with Yu-Gi-Oh from all of the old school games and even new school games is every game tries to slow every player down usually. To say like, okay, well, you need a certain amount of resources to do a thing, right? In Magic, it's lands. So you have your deck. Your deck has lands. They're kind of like energy cards, and then you put them on the field, and then you use them to play cards, right? In Pokemon, the energy cards are what pay for the attack cost, right? So you can't do everything on turn one because you don't have all the energy turn one.
Mhm.
In Yu-Gi-Oh, though, because its resource system is like how you summon cards. Really, your resources are the cards you have access to in your hand and your deck at any given time. And what I've heard and seen a little bit when I watched random games here and there in person is the card pool for Yu-Gi-Oh! It is, I don't know if they have other formats. I'm sure they do, but the main format is just the main format, and it's eternal, meaning every card that's ever been printed is
Blue Eyes White
potential.
Dragon.
Yeah, is potentially up for play. But because of that, you think about how complicated Magic can get. Yu-Gi-Oh is, I think, several orders of magnitude more complicated,
I
and
would agree.
it means that players can win sometimes on turn 1 or 2, and that is a
You definitely
common. Yeah.
like you can play solitaire in Yu-Gi-Oh, basically. It's just I think I think out of the quote unquote big three, it's the toughest barrier to entry just because one, again, it's eternal. It's literally the entire thing. And they do like work on stuff in there, right? They don't just like, oh, go free. They have like banned cards, restricted cards, things like that. They have tried to maintain the format in a specific way so it's not like just one thing dominates all, but it's just crazy the amount of stuff that you can do, and if you're 20 years late, that is so intimidating.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. Is like it's intimidating to get into, but if you're the kind of player that is like for you Pokemon, you're playing on easy mode in your brain and you're like I would love to find a game where like I can try to combo every time I play. Like I like being able to just go crazy.
And play online.
Yeah, and play online. The online client gets a lot of praise. People
Yeah,
love
I
the
love the
online
online
client.
client. I love the online client. it would be the only way that I play Yu-Gi-Oh, unless I
Yeah.
had someone who is a Yu-Gi-Oh like master sitting across from me, teaching me how to do things and making sure I do it right.
So that's a very brief description of like how the feel of the old school games goes.
Hmm.
And I think I want to like cap off the old school by saying when card games really got kicked off in the 90s, every card game, I mentioned like the resource system. Magic had lands, and you had to fill your deck with lands, which meant that there was usually a certain percentage of cards that were not really that interesting, right? Like, and you could have games where you just don't see enough lands and you just lose because you just don't have enough. Or late in the game, all you draw are these useless cards. Pokemon is not dissimilar to that, right? You have energy. And even though Pokemon has a lot of cards they've made over the years to help you draw, look through your deck, whatever, I think we've all been Iono'd, Marnied, let loose Marshadow, whatever,
Just a bad starting hand.
to a hand that has maybe a one too many energy, and then you top deck another energy, and you're like, I don't need this. Or you're looking through your deck and you don't find one energy, and you're like, well, why? Um, I think that is just a general mechanic that you'll see is different in all of the games that are designed in the last 5 years.
Hmm.
So, getting into the last 5 years, Jake, what game do you want to start with?
I think we should probably talk about Digimon first, because I think Digimon, you have so much experience
Extensive.
in
Yeah.
Digimon, whether that's creating content, casting world championships, right? Playing yourself. So, and I think Digimon can really run into another one of the card games on our list that we'll talk about today. I think having played both of those card games, I think they're very similar. And then, you know, um, I
We can
don't
go
know
through
if
the
it
others.
goes into the brand new one that just came out, but anyways, I think
Yeah.
Digimon is a great start.
Yeah. So, Digimon, we can start with. It's a card game from Bandai, which they've done lots of card games in the past, but I think the last 5 years they've really cracked a formula for like what makes a Bandai game a Bandai game. They started
Mhm.
with Dragon Ball Super actually, and they're rebooting Dragon Ball Super to make it to use a lot more mechanics that they have learned over the years from One Piece and Digimon. They're
Really?
rebooting it, yeah, in January.
Oh, oh,
So, but
I'll look out
anyways,
for that.
yeah. But Digimon, the main, the biggest difference in Digimon is the resource system. I think that's the thing that players will be a little confused by, but also once you get into it, you're like, oh, this is ingenious, which is the what do you call it? Not energy. I'm losing my mind. How do I not memory? So in Digimon, the theme is that you've got you're a digital thing, so your memory determines how much you can do and process at a time. Memory in Digimon is a shared resource. So at the start of the game, you start your turn. Opponent starts with 3 memory, and each card costs a certain amount of memory to play. But if you go over 0, if you go past 0, then after your action, it immediately becomes your opponent's turn. That's how turns go. Um,
Mhm.
and the nice thing about that is you can try to play the game so that your opponent has as little memory to work with on their turn as possible. So that's one strategy. Or you can just slap down a big thing. Say you've only got an 8 memory thing in your hand. Well, if you really want turn 1, you can play the big thing. Like you're allowed to. Your opponent will now have a lot of memory to work with on their turn, so they might be able to do even more. But that flexibility means that you are rarely in a situation where you're looking at your hand going, I'm not allowed to play because I don't have the resources, right?
Mhm.
You might be limited, but you're almost always allowed to play. Um, so I think that's like the biggest difference. Outside of that, though, the other big difference between Digimon and honestly even Magic and other card games from Pokemon is card draw.
Yes.
Yeah, like in Pokemon, whenever people watch me or others play Pokemon from other card games, they're like, you're like looking through your deck half the game. You're drawing 20 cards in a turn. Like, this is insane. But in these other games, that's because they only draw 1, 2 cards per turn. And there
Hmm.
are basically in a lot of games and in Digimon, I don't know how it is exactly now, but for the longest time, there's no such card that just lets you look through your deck for a card. It doesn't exist.
Hmm.
So there's a lot more emphasis on consistency of your deck. One-ofs are much more infrequent in Digimon, I would say. Yeah. But Jake, you played some Digimon. What are your
Would
feelings?
you? I have a quick question for you. Would you say that stall decks are active in Digimon? Like, or
So,
were like the point of the deck was to deck out your opponent?
so that is interesting. Yeah, in Digimon, your goal is to get through all of your opponent's security. So if you're attacking and your opponent doesn't block with one of their monsters, then you hit their security, you flip over the security, and then you basically, if it's a monster, it battles the monster. And if it's a card that has an effect, that effect can hurt your opponent or help you. So there is a consequence to attacking your opponent typically. Um, and in terms of stall, the way that people build stall decks in Digimon, it's called security control.
Mm.
Um, so instead of you trying to take out your opponent's security, you try to constantly replenish your own security with cards that will negatively affect your opponent.
Imagine if Sander, in his stall decks could, when he gets down to one prize card, could add a prize card from his deck and just make it 2 prize cards or
Or
3.
add 3 prize cards or whatever. So
Yeah.
you're just constantly like, and then every time you attack, you're like, is my whole board going to get blown up when I attack now? Let's
Hmm.
see. Um, that is a thing in Digimon for sure. And people have very strong opinions against it. Some people for it, but that is definitely an interesting mechanic because the main thing I think Digimon has solved is they do have in both Digimon, Dragon Ball, and One Piece, which we'll get to in a second, they have a like a life or a security type mechanic. But
Hmm.
for Pokemon, the prize cards they go in there, and for the most part, you just have to say, "Oh, well, if something important is in there, then I just lose," right? And which kind of sucks with Pokemon. Like you usually can't ever get those cards back, and
And
when
they
you're
only, here's another thing, you only get those cards when you do something damage wise. All these other
exactly.
games that we're talking about, Digimon, One Piece, whatever, you get the life cards when your opponent hits you. So it's like
Yes.
reverse of Pokemon.
Yeah.
And
So
so that by that same notion, you don't want to run out in these other card games, whereas Pokemon, you do want to run out of prize cards.
yeah, I think that is an important point though, because like in Digimon, your security or your prize cards kind of are a threat to your opponent. They're
Hmm.
usually doing something for you, right? They, they're hidden. You don't know what you're going to hit, so it might deter your opponent from going all out. And in other card games, when you hit, you get the card added to your hand potentially. So the nice thing about that, to Jake's point, is in Pokemon, it can feel like a runaway train where your opponent is doing well. They take prize cards. Now they have more resources. It's almost like they're getting rewarded for
It's a
winning, which
snowball effect.
exactly. And these other games from Bandai have kind of tried to solve that to say, hey, you might be winning the game in one respect, but now your opponent has a way to come back.
They have more cards, more things to work with, more things to do. In terms of Digimon, going back to the original
Yeah.
question that you posed, Digimon, how did I like Digimon? How do I enjoy Digimon? I think Digimon is a ton of fun. I mean, I think it's a cool game that is much different. I think at times, though, because one of the draw effects of Digimon is digivolving, right? And so there are specific rules to digivolving with like the memory costs and things like that. And the memory is not hard to figure out, but many, not every single Digimon, they have these like secondary effects that when you digivolve, you have to remember what's under them, right? What they digivolved from. And so you can get these gigantic combos, right? If you've digivolved this dude 5 times, he may have 5 different effects that can activate when he swings into the opponent and things like that. So there is a little bit of complexity in that aspect. It's not like Pokemon to where if I evolve Mew into Mew VMAX, that Mew V is basically non-existent. For the most part, Digimon, the things that you evolve from are very much still impactful or still an impact in the game. So
Yeah.
I do like it. I think it is simple to understand. For a sense, there was a time where, like Sean and I played on a Discord call, and I did not do that bad. Just messing around, on my own with the stuff. I had bought a couple starter decks and whatnot, and I modified a little bit of it, and it was all right. Digimon, I feel like, at least, I mean, it may just be my local area. Digimon, One Piece, Flesh and Blood, Lorcana, which we'll talk about later, spoiler alert. Those are probably a little bit harder to find locals. Those are probably much, much harder to find than the 3 that, you think of. So,
Yep.
but I mean, I enjoyed Digimon. I think if you're looking for another card game and you like Pokemon, then you'll probably like Digimon, because even though the card games are different in the aspect, IPs are very similar.
Yeah. I love the point you made about the inheritable effect. So,
Yes, that's what
yeah,
it's called.
it's a great that between memory and inheritable effects, I think those are the 2 general mechanics of Digimon that are the most transformative. And really make it a different game from anything you've probably ever played before. So, yeah, I think the challenge that Digimon has, if I were to give it any challenge, is I think a general Bandai problem, which
Mhm.
is Bandai is a company whose goal is to license IP and generate as much revenue off of that hype at that license as they can within a time window. And because of that, they typically have a history of designing card games that will last for 3, 5, 7 years, maybe. In the process, there is a lot of power creep because they need people to buy the new sets. Every game
Mhm.
kind of has that, but currently, there's no rotation to any of these card games. They might have slight alternate formats, but for the most part, the challenge that I think Dragon Ball Super has, and that I'm sort of seeing a bit with Digimon now, is the power creep adds a lot of complexity to those top tier decks where all of a sudden a lot of Digimon decks are what people would call OTK, one turn kill decks.
Mhm.
So you don't actually win on turn 1, but you just play a game where, like, I'm going to leave my dude in the safe area in the back, build him up really strong. The first one to do that and get him out wins the game.
Yeah.
And that can be very frustrating, I think, to a lot of people. But that's an aspect of power creep that Bandai I don't think is as worried about, because this is my gut opinion. I think that they're very okay with a game being one that lasts for 5 years, 7 years. They cool it off for 5 years, and then they bring back a new version of the game. They've done it with Digimon 4 times now.
Mhm.
Um, and they're doing it with Dragon Ball, and they had Dragon Ball Z before that. So in terms of investing into a Bandai game, play it for now. I would not buy into the game thinking of them as like long-term games. That's my piece of advice.
And I think this is a great transition into One Piece, because I think One Piece, also a Bandai game, very, very new. Probably, I mean, the second newest card game out of the ones that we'll talk about. The first booster box, the first set, Romance Dawn OPO1, came out in December 2022. And at the day that we recorded this, actually, Friday, what day is it? The 22nd? Actually, the fourth expansion came out today. I went and got a booster box of it earlier, picked up my pre-order. But I don't know much about Flesh and Blood. I don't know much about Disney Lorcana, but I think One Piece is probably the easiest card game to pick up. In my personal opinion, I truthfully believe having someone, my partner who has now played several different card games with me, just learning due to affiliation. I think One Piece has been the easiest card game for us to learn. So in One Piece, you have a deck, and similar to what we've talked about in GLC, Gym Leader Challenge format, there's a specific color. So every deck has what's called a leader, and that leader is always on the field. Your leader may be red, your leader may be green, your leader may be multicolors like red and blue. Whatever color your leader is, all of your cards in the deck need to be that color, right? If I am playing a green leader, I cannot have red cards in my deck. So you have a certain restriction. Right now, there is red, blue, yellow, black, purple, green, and I think that's it. White, maybe. No, I don't think there's white, but there may be in the future. Anyways, I could be wrong. That's not the point. So the energy system, even though it's a Bandai game, it's a little bit different than Digimon. So you have two decks basically, and don't be intimidated by this. One is your actual deck with all your cards, and the other one is what's called a Dawn deck. Dawn is your resources. Every card in your Dawn deck is the same. You just have 10 of them, right? You have 10 what's called Dawn. And so Dawn is used, and that's your energy resource. At the beginning of the game, the player is going first, flips over one. They have one Dawn, one energy resource to use for whatever is in their hand. Similar to Digimon, every card has like a cost, right? How you were talking about with the memory cost. Every card has a Dawn cost. And so you rest or tap, that one Dawn that you got if you're going first, and you can play a character that costs one. The next turn, so let's say I just did that. You unrest the one that you had, so you start your turn, and you flip over two more. So now your second turn, if you went first at the beginning of the game, you have 3 Dawn now to work with. You draw a card at the start of every turn. Similar to Digimon, the draw is not, I would say the draw in One Piece is less than Digimon, because Digimon you draw every time you evolve. One Piece you really just draw once per turn, and then maybe if a card, so your character cards, your attackers, like in Digimon, they could have effects that say like, look at the top 5, grab something, put the rest of the bottom of the deck, or whatever. They could have those kinds of effects. Your leader, always on the field, can attack in your turns. Your characters that you put down that cost that Dawn, they can attack. You can also use your Dawn. Let's say I have 3. I put a character that costs 2 down, right? I technically have 1 left. I can use that 1 to add additional power to my characters that are attacking. So it's very interesting in that aspect. It's pretty easy to get with because you have just cards that you work with, right? It's not like a memory system where like Sean had an explosive turn and I'm left with only 1, right? It's just based on what turn I'm on, and this is how much I have to work with, right? And I just do whatever I want in this hand. Now, the complexity of One Piece, there's 2 ways that you can play it. You can play it to where you just do things during your turn, yada, yada, yada. But you can also do things on your opponent's turn. So there are what's called counter cards, and they're very clearly labeled, so you know exactly like which one is a counter card, etc., etc. You can play a counter card, so if Sean has a leader that's 5,000 and he swings into my 5,000, I got to be higher than that or I lose. So I can rest some Dawn that I had left over, and I can play this counter card that says, give your leader plus 3,000. And so then I win the battle, per se. So there is a little bit of counter actions that you can do. There's also specific character cards that are like, discard this card, give your leader plus 1,000, whatever. That's very common in One Piece cards, so you could do that as well. But yeah, I mean, that's similar to the memory, I'm sorry, not the memory, similar to the life in Digimon. You put out a couple per game. It varies based on how much leader you have, which that's a whole other thing. Again, very easy to learn. I won't explain too much, but whenever you swing at your opponent, they look at their life card, see if it has like a trigger effect or something, or they just put it in their hand. And again, similar to Digimon, you may be taking away their life to get closer to winning the game, but they're adding more cards in their hand to be able to counter you the next turn. The starter decks in One Piece, I think, are really, really good. One Piece does have a little bit of an issue of power creep now that they're in their fourth set, or what I should say is negative power creep almost. The original cards are really good. In the beginning cards are very, very good. You still see, I think one of the best leaders arguably is from set one, Rono Zoro. He came in the very first set. He's like a top 3 leader. Edward Newgate, Whitebeard Pirates, I think also, it was either set 1 or set 2. One of the best. Eustace Kid in one of the very first starter decks, also a really good leader and a really good deck. So you have a little bit of that, but I think some of the other decks that have come over time really hold their own. So like personally, I play with a leader from the third set and it does a pretty good job. I mean, I think it handles itself well. My partner plays a starter deck, a yellow starter deck, pretty much variants. We've just added cards, from the starter deck. And we went to a locals the other day. She almost won the game against like a real meta deck, a real fleshed out meta deck. So again, I think One Piece is the easiest card game to get into. It's very new. It's still popular. Sometimes products a little bit harder to get, but the starter decks, you can get the starter decks for pretty cheap. A starter deck that you can use in like a locals event or something like that is only like $15 USD. So pretty doggone cheap in my opinion.
Jake, question for you, because in Digimon, the starter decks would oftentimes have cards that are exclusive to the starter deck. Does One Piece have that or no?
Yes, One Piece does have that. There's 2 kinds of different cards that come in, besides like promo reprinted cards. There are starter deck cards, and in the bottom, it'll say like ST07. That means it came from starter deck 7. And it's that one card. Now, I think every card in the starter decks in One Piece, maybe that specific art at least, comes in the starter deck only. So, like, if you, for example, Red, there's a card called Guard Point. It's a very good card. It only comes in the One Piece starter deck number 1. In that, and it has not been, to my knowledge at least, reprinted in any other form or fashion. So that's a little bit something that is not good, in my opinion, of One Piece, is that you have to, if you want a 4 of some of the cards, you have to buy 2 of the starter decks, right? Like I only have 2 guard points. I need 4 of them. I can either buy the singles on like TCG Player, which are pretty cheap. I mean, they're not super expensive, or I just outright just buy a second starter deck. So that's a little bit of the in One Piece in my opinion. But again, overall, I think I've been loving the game. I've been playing it so much more than Pokemon lately.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that One Piece, of all the games that we're going to talk about today, if you want to try something new that is going to have enough product so that you can get into it cheaply,
at the beginning basic level.
Yeah, at an early level of the game where it's not too complicated. I think One Piece probably is your game at this point. Like, yeah, like there are certainly like the meta decks might be expensive for whatever reason. But yeah, the one thing I would also say with Bandai though, if you're looking to get into a Bandai game competitively, any Bandai game, competitive events are few and far between compared to Pokemon or Magic or any other game. They have like physical regionals, but they're not very often. It's a big complaint people have had. And they do a lot of regionals over webcam, which is interesting. Like I ran lots of webcam tournaments myself. The problem for me with webcam is that like there's a lot of cheating that happens. You know, I'm sure there's a lot with Pokemon too, but when you're physically next to a human, it's harder to get away with it. And also Bandai likes to print lots of promo cards that you can only get from competing in events.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a starter deck card they just learned this the other day. So when we went to the locals, there was another guy there, not us, that won. Was number one in the $5 buy-in tournament or whatever. He got like a winner pack, and he pulled a reprint of one of the starter cards from the starter decks that was pretty meta, and it has like a brand new art. It's a full art. It's a winner promo on it. And I remember as well, pre-releases, you get a pack for a pre-release where they all have a pre-release stamp on it. Just for entering in the tournament or whatever, we got a specific promo pack with different arts on it. So in One Piece especially, and then this might be similar in Digimon. I haven't played Digimon locals or events or anything like that, but there is way more promo packs that I think Pokemon is trying to mirror with the Play Pokemon series packs that they've been doing the every so often. I think they're trying to mirror what like Bandai's doing with that stuff.
Yeah. So net Bandai games, I think Bandai represents a very like a new modern wave of how to think about game design in TCGs. I think they're at the forefront of it. So keep an eye on them. If there is an IP that you love that Bandai is doing, like I said, they're rebooting Dragon Ball Super early next year. So if One Piece and Digimon are not something that you vibe with, but you're like, yo, I love Goku, I love whatever. I think look into that next year when they reboot it. They're simplifying it a lot, but I think Bandai is the ultimate game for people, the ultimate company for people who love like different anime IP. And if you just want to play with cards from that, they're a great option. The last two we'll talk about, we'll end it on this one. I think we can talk about
quicker.
Yeah, I'll briefly talk about Flesh and Blood. Neither Jake nor I really play Flesh and Blood. I want to bring it up though because it's one of the only, well, it's a recent Western game that I think it's the most different from every other game that we've talked about, probably. In Flesh and Blood, similar to in One Piece, you have a leader, you have like a character, and that character has a class, like warrior or wizard or whatever. I don't know all of them, and you have to build your deck either with generic cards or with cards that only have that class type on it.
So it's similar to like One Piece that I was talking about.
Yes, exactly. So, but the difference with that is the concept of the game is that you are the character and you are fighting against your opponent who has their own character. So a great video I watched compared it, said it's not really like Magic. It's more like a card game version of Street Fighter, where you have like equipment that starts on the field. Like you start the game with weapons and equipment on the field that you decide beforehand. And each turn you are attacking. And when you attack, you can play other cards from your hand, use resources to like add effects to the attack. And then your opponent can play cards in response to try and block that attack, to take some of the damage, whatever it might be. So similar to like a sword fight or duel, you are using your cards to like fight your opponent, and your opponent is trying to block. And over time, as you get worn out, you maybe become a little weaker, and eventually one person wins. So I just wanted to mention that it's a very different style of game, but if you ever wanted to play a game where you embody a character in all of the mechanics and everything you do is about individual attacks and your opponent and like individually blocking or knowing when it's okay to take damage and then whatever, like I think Flesh and Blood is an interesting game that it's got a big base of fans, and prices have definitely, I think, come down, at least for packs in the last year.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, truthfully, I have no knowledge about Flesh and Blood, so having it be like one person is very interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about it.
I mean, yeah, it's very different, right? So I think, but those interested, I think the nice thing about Flesh and Blood is there's something called Blitz decks, which are kind of like half decks that you can get on the cheap. And if you want to just try it with a friend, if you're at a game store, pick up a Blitz deck each, play the game, and I think for like $20 you can get a sense of like, is this the kind of game I want to get into?
Yeah, but I do like that.
But last game that we're going to talk about is the talk of the town in the last couple of months, which is Disney's Lorcana. Jake, I know a bit about it, but I want to know for somebody who doesn't play it, what is your perception of Disney Lorcana?
I don't know anything about it. I watched Jared Grimes' video of him entering like a pre-release or whatever, or a starter deck introduction day of Disney Lorcana. I have watched a stream of a Disney Lorcana locals. I don't really know. I really can't tell you anything about it. I just know there's two spots on the field besides where like your deck and whatever goes. There's like the main character space, and then there's a space called like the inkwell or something. Yep. And the inkwell just had flipped over cards, and I didn't know what those flipped over cards meant. And
yeah,
I know about nothing.
Okay, I will say in general the game, it's very similar to Magic in that you can play any number of characters onto the field. Like in Magic, it's not like, in Pokemon you have one person that fights. But you know how like in One Piece kind of, and in Digimon you can play a bunch of different Digimon?
Yes. Yeah.
And in Digimon, especially, there is no phasing to your turns, right? You have the beginning of your turn where you draw, and if there's any effects that happen then, and then you have the end of the turn where if there's any effects that happen, great. But then everything in the middle can be in any order that you want it to be. You can attack with one thing, or technically in Lorcana, it's questing for lore, which I'll get to in a second. But like, you can tap a character to do a thing here, then you can play a card from your hand, and then you can do another thing. And so the gameplay is very dynamic, and it's like Magic or Digimon in that you have a bunch of different characters. And the goal of Lorcana, it's like flip Magic on its head. Disney doesn't want people killing each other. They don't want people reducing their opponent's life to 0. So instead, you use your characters to quest for lore. And each character has a different amount of lore that they can quest for. It's usually between 1 and 3. But you do the same thing as you do in Magic. You put them sideways to quest for that lore. And the goal is to go from 0 to 20. First one to 20 wins. So... like right now there's only one set out. I guess one other mechanic I should mention.
New.
Yeah, very new. One other mechanic I should mention is you said the inkwell. So like lands in Magic, that stuff that you see at the bottom tells you how much you can do on your turn, basically. So the more ink you have to spend, the more you can potentially do if you have cards in hand. The difference though is that they are taking cues from modern game design where almost every card in your deck you can use as ink instead of using it to play.
Oh.
Yeah.
So you can start a turn with like 4 ink, but if I'm like, this card is garbage in the matchup, I just make it ink to put yourself at like 5?
Yeah. You can do it once per turn.
I don't know how I feel about that. That's interesting though. It's definitely different.
It's unique in that, and it's unlike Magic and other games where sometimes you need a specific color of land, or with Pokemon, a specific color of energy. There is no color of ink. It just is or it isn't. Some cards technically you can't do it, but most cards you can. So as long as you look at your hand, and a big thing about the game is at some point deciding, do I want to ink another card? Do I need more ink? Do I need to do more? Or you're like, actually, I would rather have these cards in my hand, and if I don't need more ink, I'll just play them instead, right? Like, to go from 9 to 10 ink for most decks is pointless. Like, what am I going to do with one more ink? I've only got one card in hand. I'll just play the card and not ink it. But overall, I would say Lorcana is still very early days. It has some interesting mechanics outside of the ink sort of system, which is there are cards that are songs. So, Disney, they're known for their songs, their musicals, whatever. And they like the idea that different characters, instead of you paying the cost directly with ink to play the song, you can have instead a character that has the same cost as the song turn sideways to sing the song for you. So you basically say, hey, instead of questing for lore with that character this turn, I'm going to choose to use it as a resource to sing the song. And then you get to do the effect of the song without having to pay from your ink. So it's an interesting way to use your characters as like a different kind of resource on the field. Like, you spent 5 to put this on the field last turn, and now I have a 5 cost song in my hand. Well, I can just use my character to sing the song and get the effect basically for free.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Any other questions of like from you, Jake, from somebody who has no concept, like what would stop you from either getting into it, or what would you want to hear that would get you into it if you were a listener?
Product for sure. I know that product has not been super easy to find, but I think that's more of early card game stuff,
Yeah.
excitement in a brand new card game. I think that's probably more the reason as to why that is. I know the singles are crazy expensive. I have heard. Like
Because
you,
there's not enough product.
yeah, and one of the things that I also feel like, which could evolve over time, you think about Pokemon in the beginning, was very similar to this. You showed me the one Mickey that you got.
Yeah, the enchanted rare.
Yeah.
So
That
hold up for
that
the
just looks
viewers.
like that just, I mean, that means nothing to me, like looking at that. Like I'm not like, oh my god, that's so sick, like it's a full art Charizard. Like it is
Yeah.
very basic. But then again, so was Pokemon in the beginning. So there's plenty of time for more rarities to be introduced. There's more time for different, styles, but I wouldn't get into the game.
I'm
But
gonna
that's just me.
Yeah, I will say, like, some people are like Disney adults, or like your kids love Disney and you really want to buy the cards because you get to play with all these characters. I totally get that.
Hmm.
Um, I will say, like, as a last note, maybe we can talk about for collectors real quick. Because I know a lot of players, but people who are looking to, like, hey, I want to collect a different card game. What are the ups and downs? For me, I think Pokemon, I really do believe Pokemon sits at the top for like artwork.
Yes.
And for specifically, not just straight up illustration, but like how the cards get printed, like the way that full arts are done with textures, with the shininess, with colors, all that stuff.
Hmm.
Pokemon has really, I think, nailed it. Um, but I think that a close second, honestly, are the Bandai games.
Yeah.
Like Jake, like looking at One Piece cards, like even
I'm doing that right now.
oh, are you
I
looking
pulled
at
it up
them?
on TCG Player. Yeah.
Yeah. Like for you, like I've always been amazed at how good, especially alternate arts, full arts, whatever you want to call
Mhm.
them, from the Bandai games. They're just gorgeous.
I think they're really well done. I mean, just even like regular cards in general, I think some of them are so good looking. It's different
Yeah.
than something like Weiss Schwartz. Weiss Schwartz, which we didn't really talk about today, but they just have like screenshots of the anime that their IP is using, while all of these feel like real new illustrated cards. Now they've played around with some ideas. They have like manga rares and stuff like that, different rarities, but for the most part, these are like all new cards, and they're all pretty like, I mean, they're not terribly expensive either, I think, for the most part. I mean, you can get um shoot. Like I pulled this super rare of Miss All Sunday. It's hard to see, but like
Yeah.
it's a beautiful card. It's a cool card, and it is worth almost nothing. Like
Yeah.
it's one of those things. I think that these are just very, very well done in One Piece, especially with all the promos that they've done and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I love collecting Bandai cards,
Yeah. Yeah, that's the one
and
thing I
they're
would say
really
in
high
general.
quality.
Yeah.
I
The
think
one
they're
thing I
high
would
quality.
say, yeah, the card
Mhm.
stock is very thick. It's very nice. In general, I would say Bandai and Pokemon, because they come from Japanese companies originally, and they have access to like the printing techniques of Japanese printers, I think that's got to be the biggest difference, because Magic, Lorcana, and Flesh and Blood, as comparison, I find all of their foilings, their full art treatments, like Magic has gotten a little bit better, I think, in the last couple of years, but generally speaking, all of them are very underwhelming to me. I know that sometimes art, it's a little bit like subjective, but Lorcana especially, like, look, I get it's Disney characters, people love that, but the fact that like the most rare version is this, and don't get me wrong, it's not bad, but like you only get one of these per case. And it's like, come on, the rest of the cards are just so, and the foiling is so basic and dull. I would say to people who are interested in Lorcana, if you love Disney, go for it, but it doesn't compare art and design wise. So, Jake, I mean, that was like a whole discussion of all these TCGs. Net, I think that Pokemon, it's still an amazing game. I think it's one of those games it's a long haul game that I think has the whole package, right? Art, collectability. I think the game itself is just really well managed and maintained. But if you're looking for other things, hopefully this discussion will have been helpful for y'all.
There's a lot out there, but as always, we will revolve around the evolving Pokemon TCG meta. Thanks for listening to the Metapod. I'm Jake. That's Sean. Next time you see and or hear us, I'll be on the other side of the country. So have fun. Take care.